Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Synergies tier list video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S all the way down to C tier. This will be our first synergy tier list for set 4. We want to be clear about the current state of the meta. Currently, the meta is constantly shifting, and as such, the value of each trait varies a lot day to day. This means that the overall power ranking for each tier is not that different from S to C. So far, each synergy can be used in one way or another depending on the situation, and of course the chosen mechanic adds a lot of value as well. We'll be ranking each synergy based on versatility, consistency, and how common it is in the meta. With all that said, let's get to it. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off the list, we have the synergies in the S tier. This consists of Dusk, the Boss, Mystic, Cultist, and Tormented. These traits are doing quite well in the meta and often get played by multiple players every game. While not all of these traits will be used in the late game, they are all helpful towards getting a top 3 or top 2 placement. Up first is Dusk. Dusk is by far one of the strongest current traits. Not only is this due to the strength of Riven, but just the fact that 2 Dusk gives a team-wide 20% spell power buff. This makes it easy to splash in, especially since Thresh is a Vanguard, meaning he's a valuable frontliner, and Cassiopeia is a Mystic, which is another strong splash trait. Besides just being a strong splash trait, it also does well with 4 Dusk, and most importantly, with the chosen mechanic, you can have 6 Dusk. By far, one of the strongest current top 3 compositions seeks to hit a chosen Dusk, preferably Riven. Next up is the Boss. Basically, this is the trait for Set. Set is easily the strongest 5-cost champion currently. The amount of damage he can output is absurdly high, and he can be thrown in practically any composition because of it. For the trait itself, it is useful because it essentially gives Set 2 lives, with the second life making him overall stronger. While it is a rather silly animation of him doing sit-ups, the fact that he heals up and comes back to do true damage makes it very powerful. Mystic is next, and much like in previous sets that the synergy was a part of, it has a ton of value in set 4 as a splash trait. Providing your whole team extra magic resist is just too good, and the majority of players will find themselves leaning into this trait every single game. A big reason for that, besides the base value of the trait itself, is due to the amount of magic damage that we're seeing in set 4. This means Mystic is even more valuable than in previous sets. And lastly, it has great champions, with all of them being situationally useful. Cultist may not be that common in the late game, but early and mid game, it's easily one of the top synergies to have. Finding a chosen Cultist early on, whether that's Elise, Twisted Fate, or Pike, often guarantees a win streak. Then all you need to do is slot in a few more Cultists for 6, and you've secured yourself a really strong stage 3 and 4. That all said, it does tend to fall off slightly in the late game. 9 Cultists can do well enough, but the overall value of the trait is more in the early and mid game. Use it as a means to get into the latter half of stage 4 and transition towards a different build using the health and gold that you've saved by playing it. And the last synergy in S tier is Tormented. This only applies to Kayn, and while he isn't as ridiculously overpowered as Set, he can still single-handedly win the late game. Kayn does need a bit more setup, as you'll ideally want Shade to go with him as well as items. But if you can secure all of those and get the bonus effect that Tormented provides, Kayn will absolutely wreck late game fights. Red Kayn is slightly more valued due to the healing, but Blue Kayn can do a ton of damage if you don't need the heal. Either way, he's going to be one of the strongest 5 costs that you can transition into in the late game. Let's move on to the synergies in the A tier. This tier consists of Brawler, Vanguard, Hunter, Shade, Assassin, Sharpshooter, Elderwood, and Spirit. These traits are all about consistency in the meta. You're often going to see them played in top-end compositions. Our first 2 traits in the A tier are top frontline synergies of the set. First is Brawler. Brawlers are basically just really beefy melee champions, and while that's a very simple synergy to have, it's quite effective. The biggest downside to Brawlers is the lack of overall crowd control, but that's okay as they do get access to Set later on, and overall the amount of damage that they can do is high enough to offset the lack of CC. The other frontline synergy to talk about is Vanguard. Vanguards have less value as armor isn't as useful with the amount of magic damage in set 4, but they can be counters to certain champions like Jhin or Ashe. By far the largest value that Vanguards provide is the CC that they have access to. Early game you've got Wukong to bonk enemies with, and later on you've got both Sejuani and Aatrox to provide a boatload of crowd control. Basically the armor of Vanguards is a bit situational in how useful it is, but the champions provide so much that it's often worth running 2 of them. Up next is Hunter. While most of us see Hunter as just a trait to buff Ashe, it's worth pointing out that Aphelios, Kindred, and Warwick are all strong champions in the right situation. But yes, at the moment in the meta, this trait is mostly just used to give Ashe more damage, and that's really all it needs to be near the top of A tier. Shade is high up in A tier because Kayn is really strong, but also the synergy itself can be devastating to backline focused compositions like Ashe or Sharpshooters. The largest downside to this synergy is that you need to have a chosen Shade to get a lot of value from it in the mid game. That and finding Kayn can be quite difficult. Despite those downsides, the damage that Shade can provide is quite a lot. Similar to Shade, we have Assassin. Assassins keep falling in and out of the meta depending on whether or not you need to kill backline focused compositions. For example, Talon was incredibly popular and then fell off when it was difficult for him to get onto champions like Ashe that sat in the corner behind a front line. So it's difficult to place this synergy as it can be quite good, but it can also be relatively useless. It really just depends on the meta. Sharpshooter is the gunslinger or blaster of set 4, and while it hasn't always done well, the fact that it can output so much damage with Jhin and Jinx makes it a viable synergy most of the time. While 6 Sharpshooters is ideal, it's possible to run 4 as a more balanced composition. It's an all-around strong synergy that opens the door to playing a different backline carry that's not just Ashe. Elderwood at the moment is basically just used for Ashe compositions. Whether that's just 3 or 6, you're most often going to play this synergy with Ashe as the main carry. It's an all-around useful trait since it buffs stacks over the course of a fight, but it's a bit hard to make work in multiple compositions. Basically, just play Ashe with it and it'll do well. And the last A tier trait is Spirit. Spirit can be difficult to fit into compositions, but it's essentially a splash trait to buff your champions. A lot of the value is due to Ahri being strong in the current meta, although Yuumi is also great since she's a mystic. Most often you're going to be playing Spirit with Shade or when playing Ahri. Alright, let's move on into the B tier. This tier consists of Divine, Keeper, Duelist, Moonlight, Mage, Enlightened, Warlord, and Ninja. These synergies are useful in the right situation, but aren't as common as the traits in the tiers above them. First is Divine. Divine is amazing if you have 2 of them, but doesn't really add that much after that. In the current meta, you're mainly just going to see Divine to help Wukong in the bonk comp. Besides that, a lot of the champions are useful like Irelia, Lux, and Lee Sin, but the value of the trait never really goes beyond playing 2 of them. Keeper is a lot like Cultist in that it's an absolutely dominant early game synergy. But unlike Cultist, once you're past the early stages of the game, it will fall off and you want to move away from playing it. That said, if you get a chosen Keeper early game, play it and enjoy your win streak through stage 2. Duelist is a lot like Keeper as it can also win streak early game with a chosen Yasuo. But unlike Keeper, you can actually play this synergy past the early game if you want to commit to a Duelist reroll build that uses Yasuo 3. Besides that, this synergy isn't really played much, at least not in the current meta. Sticking with the early game theme, next up we have Moonlight. Being able to instantly have a 2-star or even a 3-star makes Moonlight quite valuable early on in the game. It also can do well later as you can potentially get a 4-star champion. Aphelios is certainly far from his former glory, but he's still a strong 4-star carry. But Diana is the current star of Moonlight as her 4-star form is a great way to top 4. Mage is up next. Mage is hard to place because 3 Mage is both not that strong and only somewhat strong if you have an Ahri. But Ahri overall does better on her own without the trait than with it. So where does that leave Mage as a whole? Basically, if you can reroll for any 3 and you have a chosen Mage, it's not a bad way to play Mage. Vanguard carry can sort of work out, and of course Ahri is very strong. But you have to commit to 6 Mage for the trait to truly shine, as the spell power loss of 3 Mages is often not worth it. Enlightened will be lower or higher on the tier list based on how well Talon and Morgana are doing in the meta. If they're doing well, this trait is easily A tier, and if they're not, it's definitely low B tier. Overall, the effect of the synergy is great, it's just not applicable to most situations. Warlord is similar to Enlightened as it's a strong synergy, but most of the time you're just not going to bother playing it. You can do well with Katarina as the carry, and even Xin Zhao has some value, but the amount that you have to commit to make this trait work is a bit too much. In the right situation, it's great, but otherwise, it's not that useful. And the last trait in the B tier is Ninja. Ninjas can be powerful, especially a Kali carry. The issue is that committing to 4 ninjas is difficult to do since there's basically only one way to play them, and that's with assassins. And that style of play is very dependent on the current meta, making it a difficult trait to play consistently. Alright, let's move on to the last synergy tier, the C tier. This consists of Exile, Dazzler, Adept, Fortune, and Emperor. Basically, these synergies are just very niche. They can do well overall, but you're not going to value them as much as the other synergies. First is Exile. Exile is great for Yasuo, but the trait itself is just a bit too limited. Yone isn't currently that strong of a late game champion, so you're basically just using this trait for Yasuo early game or Yasuo 3. Next is a bit of a controversial placement, Dazzler. Dazzler was super good prior to set 4 going live, but it's fallen off considerably as the trait's effect just isn't getting as much value as it used to. That said, it can be a great splash trait, but Quicksilver does negate it, so you won't get that much value for the first 12 seconds of a fight. Adept is very similar to Dazzler. It used to be quite strong, but its value went down tremendously over time. It's still useful to splash in, but again, like Dazzler, it's countered by Quicksilver. Next up is Fortune. Fortune is by far the most niche trait of set 4, as it can be amazing or do practically nothing. You need to commit to losing, which is a bit counterintuitive, in order to get value from it. Basically, Fortune is the type of trait you only play when you have the exact conditions necessary to make it work, otherwise it's just not worth it. And lastly, we have Emperor. Emperor is technically the trait for Azir, but it just doesn't do him justice. Azir is quite strong with his ultimate, and while the sand guards the synergy provides are somewhat useful, they're overall just not that amazing. Doesn't really feel like much of a synergy buff in the same way that the ones for Set and Kayn are. It's just a nice little thing that you get for playing Azir. And that's going to be it for today's tier list video. We are just scratching the surface of set 4, so expect to see the meta constantly shift. The chosen mechanic really can make any synergy viable, so don't let these rankings influence your choices too much. Let us know in the comment section below if you think any trade should be higher or lower on our list. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.